castle on the hill.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Well, you know, I only did 3 videos on this channel, and I kind of apologize for not putting up more videos. This is not my main channel, but I wanted to I want to revisit my channel and try to upload some videos now, because the 3 that I did, you know, 2 of the 3 did very well, so I must have been doing something right. But one thing I didn't do when I first started the channel was actually tell you guys what my PLEX server build is, because that's sort of important, you know, if you're going to be running PLEX, to actually have a decently powered, it doesn't have to be a really powerful, just a decently powered machine if you're going to do any, unless you just plan on being able to do all direct streams. But I didn't ever actually tell you guys what I was running, so that's what I'm going to do today in this video, is just simply tell you guys what I'm running. Now, the actual specifics for this computer is I actually had a PLEX server before this. It was running an old AMD FX 6300, the old AM3 socket, and those are really power-hungry CPUs. They were getting a bit long in the tooth. They were not very efficient, and they didn't have the best instructions for clock cycle. They just were getting old, and I wanted to upgrade this computer. So a few years ago, I decided to just totally rebuild the computer, because I wanted something that was much lower power, but still had the muscle to convert or transcode a video in case it needed to go, let's say, from one format to another to play on a mobile device or something. You need some power to do that in real time. So that's why I wanted a computer that had some power. And what I decided to do was go in something with some integrated graphics. And what, as you can see here on the screen on CPU X here, because I'll mention in a minute I'm running a Linux, is this is the AMD Athlon series, but it's the Zen, well, I thought it was Zen 1, but it says 12 nanometer here. That would imply Zen Plus, so like the second, sort of the in-between the first and second generation, like the refresh of the original Zen architecture. This is a 2-core, so it's a dual-core, 4-thread processor. It also runs the Radeon Vega 3 graphics, so it's got 3 compute units of integrated graphics of the older, but still pretty decently powerful Vega graphics from AMD. What was really attractive about this is not only the low power of this, but the fact that this thing is really cheap. It was like $55 or something like that. So it's got enough power to run a PLEX server, unless you need to transcode a whole bunch of streams. This is going to be able to do the job, and it can run your desktop. And you don't need a dedicated graphics card for this, because it should be able to do hardware encoding, though it's a little bit, I don't know in Linux if this is doing it, but in Windows you definitely would be able to activate the hardware. They may call it hardware acceleration or something like that. When they say hardware encoding and transcoding and decoding, well, decoding is playing back the video. A lot of devices have that hardware support, but encoding is actually converting or re-encoding a different bit rate or different containers, and that's something that requires a lot more power, and a specific hardware for that is usually on the graphics card. It's dedicated to being able to do that specific task, and that really takes a load off the CPU, but it's also much faster. But it may not be quite as good a quality, but it's much faster, and you can do a lot more streams if you're using the hardware for that. So anyway, this should have the ability to do that. But again, this is a 2-core, 4-thread processor. It's really cheap, and it's something that someone could still consider buying one of these lower-end APUs from AMD especially. Intel's will work good too, because their integrated graphics, even though it's not good for gaming, I think it's QuickSync or something. It's their own version, like NVIDIA and AMD have their own versions of that hardware decoding and encoding. The Intel one's very, very good. So you could certainly use the Intel processors that do have that in the integrated graphics. This thing, I just want to give you guys an idea of the cost and everything, so I'll try not to blab too much. But that's like $55, and then another board is a gigabyte B450 Aurora's motherboard. That wasn't very expensive. You should really get one of those for probably around $100. And then you can see I'm running the Pop! OS 21.04, which I'll discuss here a little more in a minute. The built-in graphics is already on the processor. The memory is like 8 gigabytes. I think Corsair Vengeance or something. It was relatively cheap, but it's DDR4. The speed of the memory for the system memory is not that important for using Plex, but if you were gaming, it would be very important. But it is running in dual channel mode, so I have 2 sticks, 4 gigabytes each. 8 gigabytes is plenty for a Plex server, especially one that's running Linux. So that's what you can see there on the hardware info. I said everything here except for the memory. And then I'm running a SATA 3 solid state drive, not an M.2, a little cheaper what those are, but it's plenty good enough to boot up and do your basic operating system stuff on a solid state drive. And then I've got another solid state drive which is older, which I use just to do transcoding on. And you can aim Plex to tell, hey, do the transcoding, the temporary files it has to create. Do that on a separate drive. Now, I realize I may be speaking over some people's heads here, so if you don't want to hear this stuff, just skip ahead. But then you've got, and then I've got 2 4 terabyte spin or old-fashioned drives, because to get really big storage, those drives are still much cheaper than a solid state drive. So I've got those to store my actual movie, TVs, videos, family videos, whatever it is that I've got on there that I want to stream. And I've got 2 of those drives in there. Now, when I did this, I wanted to go with Linux because I used Windows in the past, and and it was fine. But when I decided I wanted to go with something that I knew was really 100% free, sure, you can put Windows on your computer and just not activate it, or you can activate it illegally if you want to. I don't recommend that, but you can do that. But if you want to get a computer and run an operating system that's going to be very stable, very lightweight, still looks really good, and is 100% free, go with Linux. Linux has really come a long ways, and these graphical user interfaces are the desktop environments that they offer. And there's a lot of different ones with all the different distros. Have really gotten good. This is the newest version of Pop! OS, and I really like Pop! OS. Pop! OS you can use different desktop environments, but they usually use GNOME. But this is a new one that they call Cosmic Desktop. It's, I think, a bit of just a souped up or slightly skinned version of GNOME. And it really looks nice. It adds this tile bar down here and just some other little features. I haven't dug around it too much, but it's really, really slick. And again, this is all free. There's a lot of different distros. In the past, I ran CentOS, which is sort of no longer being developed. That one had more animated graphics, and the integrated graphics on this CPU doesn't run that very well. And before that, I ran Linux Mint, which really is a good one. I went away from it because I thought I had an issue, which ended up not being Linux Mint's fault. And that's a one I'd recommend as well, especially if you are used to Windows. If you're used to Microsoft Windows, Linux Mint will look the most similar to it. And when you're setting this up, a lot of people don't like Linux because, you need to know command lines and stuff. And yeah, that can be true, but it's kind of come so far with this that you don't generally need to know too many command lines in terminal. But whenever you set up Plex, it usually just wants to see your main solid state drive that the operating system is installed on. You lots of times have to give Plex permission to see your other drives, and that can be, it's not hard, you just have to know that command to put into the terminal. But when I set up Linux Mint, I don't recall having to do that. It's like they, the Linux, it knew to tell Linux, hey, you give access to Plex, and it comes from Linux Mint store, just like here in Cosmic Pop! OS, they have their own store down here called the Pop Shop, and I've opened that up. If you get this, you want to get, you should get Plex from their store. You can get the versions, and you can see it installed down here directly from Plex, but I'm pretty sure I installed it directly from, and there it is, Plex Media Server. They also have the PLEX amp, which is, I think, a new music player. Jellyfin is one I've tried in the past. It's similar to PLEX. It's even more open source, because PLEX I do pay a little bit for. You don't have to pay for it. It gives you a little bit more options. But yeah, if you go into PLEX Media Server, it says open because it's already installed. Install it from there. It'll work perfectly. It will update itself when it needs to be, or it'll tell you to, and you can update it. Or I think you can tell it also to do it on its own. And it's a real simple process. It just asks you for your password. So I highly recommend PLEX on Linux because it's so quick. Another example is whenever I'm using, and I've got these hard drives here, if I'm in my folders and I want to copy a movie from one folder to another or something for some reason, and it's even on the same hard drive, it does it very quick. A couple of minutes for, let's say, a 4 or 5 gig file. Even quicker if you're copying from one drive to another. If you did that on Windows, you're looking at way more time. Windows used to be terrible, especially in the Windows Vista and 7 days. It's gotten a little better with Windows 10, but just copying files. Linux doesn't use the resources in the background. It's just a slimmer operating system, and if you wanted to run it off of just a spin drive, it's still going to run really snappy. Even though solid state drives have gotten so cheap, I highly recommend using that for your main OS drive. You don't have to. If you got an older laptop sitting around, say you want to make a PLEX server, as long as it has a decent CPU, you should be able to, and that may have a spin drive. You can use that, especially if you want to just go with Linux. So on a laptop, you do run into sometimes you're more likely to run into a driver issue, but you probably will be fine. It's usually something silly like a Wi-Fi chip or something it doesn't want to always see. But Pop! OS is really, really good. So if you go into PLEX, you can see I got the movies on here and such, and it just runs really, really well on Linux. And while I go, my family was watching a movie here under the activity and the dashboard. You can see we're running all on here, and you can access all the stuff that you can under Windows. It looks identical, but it runs really well on Linux. So that's my recommendation. Run it on Linux. Pop! OS, Linux Mint are two good ones. Ubuntu's fine, because that's sort of like the core of what Pop! OS is, I believe. But you could, Elementary OS is a good one. If you want to know, like Linux, it's like distrowatch.com, I believe it is. Lists all the most popular ones. There's so many of them out there. Such huge communities dedicated to this open source Linux software. So if you are new to Linux and you want to try it out because you want something that's lightweight, runs well, I recommend looking at Linux Mint. If you're a little bit more computer savvy, then I would suggest Pop! OS. Those are my two recommendations for a software side for the Linux server. And then you heard my information on the hardware. Something on a lower end integrated graphics from AMD or Intel, just as long as it's newer, will be fine. Go with some speedy memory, but it doesn't have to be the fastest. Get yourself a decent amount of RAM, and then get yourself big hard drives, and you can build this yourself. There's plenty of build videos on YouTube on how to build a computer. You can build yourself a lot better computer, especially if you run Linux, than going out and buying a budget PC at Walmart. Those are lots of times going to be handicapped in terms of they don't have a lot of memory, and they're going to they may have a really cruddy CPU in there. And you're just going to get a lot more if you build it yourself, in my opinion. Your local Micro Center or Amazon or Newegg, someplace like that, to build, which is what I did. So this has really been a fine computer for me. I have many years left in it. I see no reason to upgrade. If you if you're going to transcode or convert video, get a little better CPU. But again, I wanted one that was lower power. I think this one is, I don't remember the watts on this one. It's either like 35 or 65. It's much less than the full Zen desktop CPUs because it's only a 2-core 4-thread, where the old FX was running way more power. It was consuming, and it literally is very similar performance-wise, but single core performance on this processor is 3 times what the 6-core FX 6300 was. So And just transcoding video, this one has no problem doing that. So that's what this has. I know it's not a whole lot to this video. It's a lot of audio, me talking, but you can see how nice Linux Pop OS looks. The applications here, you can see the stuff installed. I don't have a lot of software. It's just really, really nice, and you can customize it quite a bit. So highly recommend that. So if you have any questions, leave a comment or question down in the below, and I'll make sure to try to get back to you. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe. If you're a returning subscriber, sorry for such a long break. I'll try to upload more videos. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.